What if Genesis is not merely explaining how the world began, but revealing the catastrophe that pushed humanity away from the presence of God? Genesis opens on a world described as formless and empty, captured in the Hebrew expression tohu wabohu. Into that darkness, light breaks forth as God begins bringing structure, distinction, and order to creation. What appears at first to be simply the origin story of everything soon becomes a diagnosis of humanity's deepest problem. Many people approach Genesis as though it were a collection of memorable stories loosely placed beside one another. They remember 7 days of creation, a beautiful garden, a subtle serpent, and a devastating flood that overwhelms the world. Others become absorbed in the turbulent family dramas that dominate much of the book's later chapters. Yet beneath all those familiar scenes, one central question quietly drives the entire narrative forward. How can humanity, exiled from God's presence because of rebellion, ever find the way back home? Genesis unfolds as a carefully designed literary masterpiece, rather than functioning merely as an ancient textbook. It exposes humanity's exile from God while revealing His plan to restore creation through one chosen family. Instead of abandoning the world after it becomes broken, God begins a rescue mission that stretches across millennia. To understand what Genesis is doing, we must remember that it was never written as a modern scientific treatise. The ancient Israelites were wrestling with questions of identity rather than investigating scientific mechanisms. They needed to understand who they were, who their God was, and how they were meant to relate to the nations surrounding them. And once you notice the structure of Genesis, an important pattern suddenly becomes difficult to ignore. Chapters 1 through 11 tell the primeval story of humanity descending again and again into rebellion and disorder. Chapters 12 through 50 then narrow the focus dramatically onto one lineage, the family of Abraham. The design moves from a universal human problem to a specific divine plan for redemption. That first primeval section begins with two creation accounts deliberately positioned beside one another. Genesis 1 presents a majestic panoramic vision in which God speaks, and creation responds by coming into existence. During days 1 through 3, attention centers on forming and organizing the chaotic world. During days 4 through 6, those newly formed environments are filled with inhabitants. Light is separated on the first day, while the celestial bodies are appointed to govern those lights on the fourth. Sky and seas are formed on the second day, then populated with birds and fish on the fifth. Land emerges on the third day, then receives animals and humanity on the sixth. This carefully balanced pattern reaches its climax with humanity created in God's image and God resting on the seventh day. Genesis 2 then brings the reader closer, presenting creation from a far more intimate perspective. Here God appears as a hands-on craftsman who shapes the man from the dust of the ground. God breathes life into him and places him inside a lush and abundant garden. Genesis 1 reveals God as the transcendent king, while Genesis 2 shows him as deeply personal and relational. But the harmony does not last, and Genesis 3 forces us to confront what happens when humanity chooses another way. The pursuit of autonomy produces neither freedom nor enlightenment, but spiritual and physical exile. Humanity is driven from the garden and separated from the immediate presence of God. That moment establishes one of the Bible's foundational tragedies, because sin repeatedly produces separation. From Genesis 3 through 11, the story begins moving through a relentless cycle of rebellion, followed by exile. Cain's jealousy becomes murder, and his violence leaves him wandering farther from God. Human wickedness eventually grows so severe that God decreates the world through a flood while preserving Noah. By Genesis 11, humanity gathers at Babel with the shared ambition of building a name for themselves. God responds by confusing their common language and scattering them across the earth. The pattern has now become unmistakable because human rebellion is repeatedly followed by exile. By the end of chapter 11, humanity is not only spiritually lost, but physically scattered throughout the world. And when the human story appears to have reached its lowest point, Genesis introduces God's unexpected response. God calls Abram away from his homeland and promises that he will make him into a great nation. Through Abram, all the families of the earth are ultimately promised blessing. That covenant promise directly answers the scattering and division produced at Babel. God begins building a family of blessing through which the curse of exile will be reversed. The rest of Genesis then shows how God continues keeping that promise, even when the people involved repeatedly fail. Abram's own name means exalted father, yet the man carrying that name begins the story without a child. In Genesis 17, God renames him Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. Sarai also receives the new name Sarah, signaling the movement from personal princess toward universal matriarch. Yet Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are never presented as flawless heroes, because each patriarch carries serious human weaknesses. Abraham repeatedly lies about his wife when he believes deception will protect his own life. Jacob bears a name associated with deception and repeatedly demonstrates that tendency by cheating his brother Esau. Through every failure, however, God remains relentlessly faithful to the covenant he has made. Jacob eventually wrestles with God and emerges from the encounter limping under a new name, Israel. The name Israel means he struggles with God, emphasizing divine grace rather than human perfection. Even the architecture of these stories reveals something deeper, because the patriarchal narratives were designed with massive chiastic patterns. Their structural symmetry presents the stories as intentionally crafted narratives, rather than a collection of random myths. Through those carefully arranged accounts, the text repeatedly emphasizes God's providential hand guiding human history. The final major movement of Genesis turns toward Joseph and dominates chapters 37 through 50. Joseph's story becomes the bridge that carries Abraham's family from the land of Canaan into Egypt. Betrayed by jealous brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph eventually suffers false accusation and imprisonment as well. Yet through severe hardship, Joseph continues trusting God and eventually rises to become second in command over Egypt. When the brothers who betrayed him finally stand before him again, Joseph chooses forgiveness rather than revenge. His explanation becomes the theological climax of Genesis, because what humans intended for evil, God intended for good. The story shows God weaving human sin into a much larger pattern of redemption and life-preserving purpose. Even the language of Genesis 1 reinforces this theme through the Hebrew word bara, translated as create and used exclusively with God as its subject. Human beings can shape and assemble existing materials, but only God is portrayed as creating order out of the chaotic void. Joseph's life, therefore, shows that God's work of bringing order from chaos continues far beyond the opening 7 days. Tohu Wabohu becomes more than a description of a primitive world, because it also reflects the broken human condition apart from God. Genesis finally closes with Joseph dead and lying in a coffin in Egypt, while Abraham's family remains outside the Promised Land. Yet Joseph dies believing the promise, requiring his family to swear that one day they will carry his bones back to Canaan. Genesis therefore establishes the problem of exile while preparing its readers for the deliverer who will eventually come. The entire book functions as the essential prologue to everything that follows in the biblical story. Seen from this perspective, God begins to resemble a master watchmaker, carefully repairing a clock whose internal order has been broken. He chooses one central gear, the family of Abraham, as the means through which the wider world will be restored. Faith in Genesis means stepping into the unknown instead of constructing towers designed to exalt ourselves. Neither ancestral history nor past failure can place someone beyond God's ability to redeem what comes next. Even when life resembles tohu wabohu, Genesis portrays God as the one who speaks order into chaos. Human choices repeatedly create new forms of darkness and disorder, yet beneath the visible turmoil, divine purpose continues working quietly through the unfolding story. Genesis begins with cosmic structure before steadily narrowing its attention toward the consequences of human choice. Eden first presents complete communion between humanity and the Creator. Into that communion, the serpent introduces suspicion about the goodness of God. Eating the forbidden fruit becomes humanity's attempt to define good and evil on its own terms. Shame appears immediately, shattering the original innocence represented by their nakedness. Their attempt to hide among the trees reveals the human instinct to conceal corruption rather than expose it. Yet God calls out to the man, pursuing reconciliation even while judgment is unfolding. The consequences of sin, then, begin reshaping relationships throughout the natural world. Expulsion from Eden prevents humanity from gaining eternal life while remaining in a broken condition. Cherubim are stationed to guard the path leading back toward the tree of life. The story of Cain and Abel immediately demonstrates how quickly corruption spreads into the next generation. Jealousy turns an act of worship into the horror of one brother murdering another. Cain becomes a restless wanderer who moves farther east of Eden. Later, Lamech openly boasts about escalating violence in arrogant retaliation. Corruption continues spreading until human thoughts are described as being continually bent toward evil. The flood then portrays creation collapsing back into the primordial chaos of overwhelming waters. Noah alone finds grace as a man whose life is marked by a righteous walk with God. The ark becomes the vessel through which creation is preserved while judgment passes over the world. When the waters finally recede, a cleansed world appears, but it is immediately clear that human imperfection remains. Noah plants a vineyard, becomes vulnerable, and once again shame enters the human story. That raises the disturbing question Genesis refuses to ignore. Why does human failure return almost immediately after salvation? Babel provides the next answer, as humanity's pride reaches upward in an attempt to ascend toward heaven. Brick and mortar become instruments of human self-reliance rather than dependence upon divine grace. By confusing their languages, God prevents humanity from continuing its unified rebellious ambition. Their scattering across the earth then creates the setting in which Abram will receive his call. Abram's journey makes clear that faith requires leaving familiar security for promises that cannot yet be seen. He travels toward Canaan while the promised lineage still remains unfulfilled. A famine soon tests that faith and drives Abram south into Egypt. His deception concerning Sarai exposes the powerful instinct of human self-preservation. God intervenes through plagues in order to preserve the integrity of the covenant. As Abram's possessions increase, conflict over resources eventually forces him and Lot to separate. Lot chooses the fertile land near Sodom because its outward appearance seems desirable. Abram, meanwhile, continues receiving repeated promises concerning the land God intends to give him. Melchizedek appears and blesses Abram while recognizing God Most High. Yet Abram later voices his deepest concern in a vision because he still remains childless. God responds by counting Abram's trust as righteousness. A solemn covenant ceremony involving divided animals then seals the oath. When the promise seems delayed, Sarai proposes a human solution through her maidservant Hagar. Ishmael is born, but his arrival introduces continuing conflict into the household. Hagar later encounters God in the wilderness and discovers him as the one who sees her. Circumcision is then established as the enduring sign of the covenant. 3 angelic visitors arrive with the promise that Isaac will be born within a year. Sarah laughs inwardly because the promise appears humanly impossible. Abraham later intercedes for any righteous people who might still be living inside doomed Sodom. The corruption of Sodom ends in catastrophic destruction by fire and sulfur. As Lot's family escapes, his wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. Isaac is eventually born according to the exact timing of the divine promise. Hagar and Ishmael are later sent away, but they remain under divine protection. Then Genesis presents an even more severe question. What happens when faith appears to demand surrendering the very promise you waited years to receive? Abraham obeys while trusting that God is able to raise the dead. On Mount Moriah, Isaac notices the missing sacrifice and asks about the lamb that should be offered. At the critical moment, an angel stops Abraham's knife, and a ram caught in a thicket becomes the substitute. Sarah eventually dies and is buried in the cave of Machpelah. Abraham then sends his servant away to find a suitable bride for Isaac. Rebekah reveals her servant-hearted character by voluntarily drawing water for the camels. Isaac marries Rebekah and finds comfort after the death of his mother. Their twin sons, Esau and Jacob, begin struggling against one another even inside Rebekah's womb. Esau later exchanges his birthright for a single bowl of red stew. During another famine, Isaac repeats his father's deception while living in Gerar. Despite opposition from local people over wells, God continues blessing Isaac abundantly. Rebekah eventually conspires with Jacob to take the blessing intended for Esau. The blind Isaac unknowingly places covenant leadership upon Jacob, while Jacob is disguised as his brother. Esau responds with murderous anger, forcing Jacob to flee north for his life. While escaping, Jacob dreams at Bethel of a heavenly ladder with angels ascending and descending. There God reaffirms the promises first given to Abraham, even while Jacob is fleeing because of his own deception. Jacob later works 7 years for Rachel, only to discover that Laban has given him Leah instead. The man known for deceiving others now experiences deception through the calculated actions of his uncle. Jacob agrees to serve another 7 years before finally receiving Rachel. Rivalry within the household eventually produces 12 sons through multiple mothers. Jacob also prospers materially through unusual breeding methods involving Laban's flocks. His secret departure from Laban leads to confrontation before finally ending in a covenant of reconciliation. As Jacob returns home, fear grips him because Esau is approaching with armed men. At the Jabbok River, Jacob encounters a mysterious divine wrestler and struggles through the night. His hip is dislocated during the encounter, leaving him with a permanent symbol of broken self-reliance. His new name, Israel, marks the transformation produced through that struggle. Yet when Jacob finally meets Esau, the brother he fears, receives him with unexpected forgiveness and an embrace. The tragedy involving Dinah at Shechem later provokes brutal revenge from her brothers. God then calls Jacob back to Bethel, where his household must remove its idols. Rachel dies near Bethlehem while giving birth to Benjamin. Isaac eventually dies and is buried by his 2 reunited sons. The genealogy of Esau then records the chiefs of Edom who develop outside the covenant line of promise. When Joseph enters the story, even something as simple as a special coat becomes the spark that exposes how deeply hatred has grown. Joseph's prophetic dreams show his brothers one day bowing before him. Their resentment becomes so intense that they conspire to kill the dreamer and throw him into a wilderness pit. Judah intervenes by suggesting that Joseph be sold instead to Ishmaelite traders. The brothers cover Joseph's coat with goat blood and deceive Jacob, plunging their father into prolonged grief. The narrative then turns briefly to Judah, whose moral failure with Tamar exposes further darkness within the family. Tamar's actions ultimately reveal Judah's hypocrisy and lead him to recognize her righteousness. Meanwhile in Egypt, Joseph serves faithfully and honorably in the household of Potiphar. After Joseph rejects the advances of Potiphar's wife, she retaliates by falsely accusing him. Joseph is thrown into prison, yet even there he continues experiencing divine favor. While imprisoned, he correctly interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. The restored cupbearer then forgets Joseph, leaving him imprisoned for 2 full years. Eventually, Pharaoh dreams about fat cows and gaunt cows emerging from the Nile. Joseph explains that the dreams announce 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh responds by elevating Joseph to the position of vizier over the entire land of Egypt. When famine spreads throughout the region, Jacob's sons are forced to travel to Egypt to purchase grain. Without recognizing Joseph, the brothers bow before him and unknowingly fulfill the dreams they once hated. Joseph then begins testing whether their hearts have changed, especially in the way they treat their younger brother Benjamin. Simeon is detained while the others return home carrying grain and the money that has mysteriously been returned to them. Jacob eventually gives reluctant permission for Benjamin to accompany them on another journey to Egypt. A silver cup secretly placed inside Benjamin's sack creates the final and most severe test. This time, Judah offers himself as a substitute so that Benjamin can return home free. Seeing the change in his brothers, Joseph breaks down in tears and finally reveals who he is. He explains that behind his painful exile in Egypt, divine providence has been working toward preservation. Pharaoh welcomes Jacob's household and invites the entire family to settle in the fertile region of Goshen. When Jacob hears that Joseph is still alive, he leaves for Egypt and travels south to see his son. At Beersheba, God speaks to Jacob and promises that his family will eventually return from Egypt. Jacob and Joseph are finally reunited in Goshen in an intensely emotional meeting. Jacob later stands before Pharaoh as an elderly patriarch and gives him a blessing. During the prolonged famine, Joseph carefully manages the Egyptian economy. Jacob later adopts Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. While blessing them, Jacob deliberately crosses his hands and places the greater blessing upon the younger Ephraim. Near the end of his life, Jacob gathers all 12 sons and speaks prophetic blessings over them. Within those blessings, the promise of the scepter is assigned specifically to the tribe of Judah. Jacob dies and is embalmed according to Egyptian custom. A massive funeral procession then carries his body back to a burial place in Canaan. After their father's death, Joseph's brothers become terrified that he may finally take revenge for what they did to him. Their fear raises one of Genesis's final emotional questions. Can genuine forgiveness overcome years of betrayal and pain? Joseph's response confirms the book's central theme that human evil cannot overthrow the divine covenant. God is able to bring good from intentions that were deliberately designed to cause harm. Joseph lives long enough to see the third generation of his descendants. Before dying, he makes the Israelites swear that one day they will carry his bones back home. His coffin in Egypt becomes a symbol of hope delayed rather than hope destroyed. The ending of Genesis therefore becomes a direct bridge from the story of origins toward the deliverance that will unfold in Exodus. Yet the ancient story continues speaking directly to the experience of modern human alienation. Humanity's displacement from Eden echoes the widespread emptiness people continue to experience. Every attempt at complete self-sufficiency carries the same impulse that once drove the builders of Babel. Genesis presents genuine security as surrender to divine promises that cannot be earned. A person's genealogy or family history never restricts the transforming power of God. Again and again, broken families become the raw material through which divine grace continues working. Events that appear to be setbacks often become necessary stages along the path toward redemption. In Joseph's story, pits and prisons come before the promotion that eventually preserves countless lives. Chaos itself becomes the place into which God speaks life and order. Israel's long story, therefore, reflects the universal human longing to find the way home. Divine covenant faithfulness survives generation after generation of human failure. Genesis establishes the foundation upon which the law, the prophets, and the wisdom writings will later build. The roots of every major theological doctrine can be traced within the narrative world of Genesis. Its pattern can be stated simply: sin separates, grace seeks, and covenant secures restoration. The promise of the messianic seed develops continuously from Eden through the line that eventually reaches Judah. Creation remains waiting for the final crushing of the serpent's head. Meanwhile, the experience of waiting in exile becomes one of the places where genuine faith is formed. Faith continues trusting promises even when their fulfillment will not be witnessed within a person's physical lifetime. Throughout Genesis, God is moving history toward an ultimate restoration of the entire created order. Human history is therefore presented not as random chaos, but as a structured narrative moving toward redemption. Even the architectural symmetry of the text points toward the work of a divine author. Genesis narrows its focus onto one family, yet that microscopic focus always serves a global purpose. The blessing promised through Abraham ultimately extends toward the diverse peoples of the entire earth. Exile may be painful, but within the sovereign care of God, it remains a temporary condition rather than the final destination. Just as Genesis begins with darkness giving way to light, divine speech repeatedly brings illumination where darkness once ruled. Across the spiritual landscape of the book, order continually confronts and displaces tohu wabohu. Every reader is therefore invited to recognize something of Abraham's journey of faith within the larger story. Stepping forward in that journey requires leaving familiar securities and comfortable idolatries behind. Genesis insists that true identity is ultimately received from God rather than manufactured through human achievement. Divine grace repeatedly operates beyond human merit and social status. Jacob's story demonstrates that even deceivers can become princes after transformative encounters with God. His limp after wrestling becomes a paradoxical sign that genuine spiritual victory may emerge through human weakness. Esau and Joseph both show how forgiveness can interrupt bitter patterns of rivalry that have lasted across generations. Joseph's life also foreshadows the pattern of an ultimate deliverer whose suffering becomes the means of saving others. In the middle of a widespread famine, life-giving bread is provided for those who would otherwise perish. Joseph's coffin remains in Egypt as a silent witness that redemption is still coming. Faith therefore looks beyond physical death toward an inheritance that remains promised even when it cannot yet be seen. The God who begins his work in Genesis is portrayed as the God who will ultimately bring that work to completion. Like a master watchmaker, he carefully aligns every intricate gear within the unfolding work of redemption. The story introduced in Genesis therefore continues through the lives of believers in the present. Humanity's exile will not last forever, because the story moves toward restored presence like the communion once experienced in Eden. The divine mission continues moving forward until blessing reaches the entire world. From creation to exile, and from covenant to hope, Genesis becomes a timeless map showing exiled humanity the road back home.